Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today to learn a little bit about why it's important to talk about responsible horse ownership. And we're doing this in the context of helping to keep horses from becoming at risk. We're also going to dive a little bit today into why it's so important to be thinking about including your horse or horses in your estate planning as well. I'd like to start off by giving you a little bit of background about myself and how I came to the UHC. I initially, like a lot of horse girls growing up, I was a little bit naive and thought if I wanted a career with horses, the only way that I could do so was either through managing a horse barn or by becoming an equine veterinarian. And I chose to try and pursue the latter. And graduated from the University of Vermont as a pre-vet student with a focus on equine science. I was a little bit burnt out at that point, and I thought I would take a year off. So I started working for a well-known rescue organization in the Boston area as their horse and livestock manager. And I was there for about 14 years while also working part-time as a certified animal control officer for the state of Massachusetts, until I went on maternity leave. And from there ended up hearing about the United Horse Coalition through Emily Stearns, who is the program manager of the Equine Welfare Data Collective. And here I am today, very excited to be part of such a great organization and working to advance UHC's mission of helping at-risk horses and those in transition. And with that, I will go ahead and give Emily, my counterpart at EWDC, a chance to introduce herself as well.
Hey, everybody.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Stearns. I am the program manager for the Equine Welfare Data Collective. Like Ashley, I grew up riding horses, also in Massachusetts, and I got my bachelor's of science in equine science from the University of New Hampshire, and then I went on to get my master's of science in equine science through the University of Edinburgh. I first met Ashley working at the Animal Rescue League of Boston, also with livestock. But from there, I went on to continue teaching at the University of New Hampshire. I also teach at Post University, and basically I'm heavily involved in research. And for the Equine Welfare Data Collective, we focus on researching equine welfare and how that all works together in owning responsibly, and the data kind of surrounding equine welfare organizations and owning responsibly and how it all works together. You can go to the next slide, Ash.
All right, so thank you, Emily. Before we get into the heart of our presentation today, I do want to give you a quick history of the UHC. We were originally formed in 2005 when the American Association of Equine Practitioners held a summit during AHC's annual conference with other equine industry partners and stakeholders. And the intent of this was to start an open dialogue on the issues that were surrounding at-risk horses in America during the time. Our original purpose was to develop a consensus on the most effective way to work together as an industry to address the issues that were surrounding horses who are at risk or in transition. And in June of 2006, the UHC was folded into the American Horse Council, where we now operate. Though our mission has slightly changed over the years, we still continue our work of educating current and future horse owners on responsible ownership. We also advocate for horses that are at risk, as well as their owners, by helping to provide resources to keep them safe at home. And an important part of carrying out our mission is maintaining our ability to collaborate with other equine industry organizations to tackle the current issues that are surrounding horses at risk or in transition, and making sure that we're keeping the industry apprised of new resources and opportunities that are available to assist these horses. The UHC is also home to the UHC Equine Resource Database, which we'll get into a little bit later, as well as the Equine Welfare Data Collective, which is a program of the United Horse Coalition.
So moving on, what is the Equine Welfare Data Collective? Our mission is to provide data analysis critical to understanding more about horses at risk and in transition, and also kind of opening up the conversation for funding organizations, organizations devoted to organizing programming to supporting these horses, and identifying how support can be aimed appropriately and how we can all drive appropriate change. So at this point, about 4 years ago, back in 2018, several organizations, the AAEP, the ASPCA, the American Horse Council, came together and kind of had this big conversation discussing the fact that they know so much information about dog and cat welfare and how that conversation's going, but that data didn't really exist for horses and donkeys and mules and kind of everything we consider equine. So who was going to be in charge of collecting that data? Who was going to be in charge of reporting that data? And it was decided upon that the United Horse Coalition was kind of a neutral party that could really focus on collecting, disseminating this information in a really valuable way. So that's what we're here today doing. We organize all of this information. We collect survey information from every equine welfare organization we can. We've identified over 1,200 at this point working in the United States. And we analyze this information and report it for free to the public. So all of our reports can be viewed on the United Horse Coalition website. And the big goal is to kind of start discussing now how this data works in the larger conversation of owning responsibly and equine welfare in general. Our funding supporters, we are currently grant funded. That's how we operate, are the ASPCA and the Right Horse Initiative, the Foundation for the Horse, which was previously the AAEP Foundation. And we've also received grants previously from USA Equestrian Trust.
Okay, so you'll hear me use the terms at risk or in transition a lot throughout this presentation today when I talk about horses. When we talk about at-risk horses, formerly termed unwanted horses, it simply means that it's an equine that has had an increased possibility of experiencing a situation of neglect, abuse, or generally poor welfare. And when we talk about a horse that is in transition, it can be any equine that is currently in transition from one home, vocation, opportunity, or owner to the next. So what does an at-risk horse look like? The truth is, it can actually be any one of these. An at-risk horse can look old or lame. Maybe they're dangerous, or they're not an easy keeper, or they might have medical issues. Sometimes they can just have outlived the purpose for which the owner originally intended for the horse. But more often than not, however, an at-risk horse can look and be perfectly normal and healthy and have absolutely no issues at all. They're simply put at risk due to their owner's circumstances. I like to share this photo anytime I'm giving a presentation as a perfect example of this. This is Sammy, my now 27-year-old adopted horse, who actually came from a neglect case I worked on in 2005. And I can say without a doubt, he's been the best horse I've ever owned. And he was put at risk through no fault of his own.
So in order to kind of begin this conversation of what an at-risk horse looks like and how that relates to responsible ownership, it's time to really kind of dig into the data a little bit, because this has become a large part of the conversation. So in terms of data we received to the Equine Welfare Data Collective, for intakes, and intakes are any horse or donkey or mule taken into custody of an equine welfare organization. So that might be your local rescue, that might be some larger national organization. But looking at data between 2018 and 2019, 14% of all intakes, which is thousands of horses at this point, are confiscated by law enforcement. So this means a living situation has deteriorated significantly enough that animal control or the sheriff's department, whoever the local responsible entity is, will take legal custody of that horse through kind of judicial means. On the flip side of that, the rest of intakes, 52% of all intakes are surrendered by owners. So this means an owner has realized their current situation is not doing justice for that horse. They cannot reasonably provide that horse with what it needs for whatever reason. It might be a financial owner situation. It might be the horse is no longer a good match for their living situation on the property. If you have only one horse at home, maybe its companion died and now that remaining horse is very lonely, very anxious. That might be a situation that horse could be at risk. So for whatever reason, 52% of all intakes nationally have been surrendered by owners. And this is where the conversation of responsible ownership really kind of starts to come into play. So how do we prevent this from having to happen? How can we help support owners from not having to surrender their animal? How can we help transition these horses into new homes in a responsible manner? Next slide, Ash. So moving on, in terms of how organizations are helping facilitate kind of equine welfare need, we surveyed all organizations across the country and are able to come up with kind of an estimated daily capacity. So on any given day in the United States, there are about 47,000 places for horses to go into the custody of welfare organizations. Based on length of stay, based on outcomes and the rate of adoption really affects how many horses per year can be helped by organizations. So there is a limit right now to how many horses can be helped by organizations. So helping to prevent owners from needing to surrender their horses to these organizations can actually help facilitate overall equine welfare and promoting positive equine welfare. Next slide, Ash. And so I just mentioned length of stay, and length of stay is a really important part of the conversation. In dogs and cats, length of stay usually hovers around 30-ish days. In horses, the amount of time a horse spends in the care of a custodial organization ranges from about 200 days when we're looking at traditional adoption and rescue centers. So an organization that takes a horse into custody, maybe it's skinny, maybe it needs behavioral assistance. And by the time it can be adopted or is adopted by a new owner, that's about 200 days at this point. Looking at rescue or municipal facilities, and again, this is kind of pretty preliminary data. You can see some of the sample sizes are a little small. Rescue and municipal facilities are looking at a longer length of stay, so about a year. Organizations that identify as rescue sanctuary combinations, so organizations that take a horse in, and if they identify that horse as not being adoptable for whatever reason, they will maintain it for the entirety of its life, are looking at about a 400-day length of stay. And then on the far end of the spectrum, we have sanctuaries. And sanctuaries are organizations that take horses into their custody for whatever reason the horse needs, with the intent of keeping that horse for the remainder of its entire life. And that length of time, that remainder of time of that horse's life, is looking to average a little less than 10 years, which is a pretty significant amount of time for an organization to need to support the wellness of that animal. So helping to identify ways to reduce the number of horses in a really positive manner by supporting owners can help to kind of facilitate organizations overall and how they're able to help horses in need. Next slide, Ash.
Okay, so how do we keep owned horses from becoming at risk? At UHC, we believe our biggest impact is in creating change that starts at the source. So through teaching owners how to be responsible for the horses in their care. We aim to give owners the resources and tools that they need to make responsible decisions on behalf of their horse. Prevention and being a responsible horse owner is key in helping to keep most horses from reaching that at-risk state, and thereby we hope keeping them out of the system. So I want to frame the rest of our conversation today with this question in the back of your mind. What happens to your horse if something happens to you today? What happens to your horse if you were to lose your job, if God forbid you should pass away today? Does your barn owner know what you'd want for your horse? Do your horse friends? Does your family? If not, you need to think about putting some plans in place as soon as possible. We're going to talk today about estate planning, but first I want to go over some of the things that you can put in place for your horse today that will increase the likelihood that your horse will be able to easily transition into a good home and hopefully make the chances of them ending up in the wrong place or at risk of abuse or neglect less likely.
So starting with the facts about horse ownership and how that works into estate planning. Next slide, Ash. So one big consideration, we just said 52% of all horses coming into rescues are coming from owner surrenders, owner relinquishments. So we need to really look at the reasoning behind these relinquishments. So requested rehoming, so owners calling organizations, asking to facilitate rehoming their horses, whether that is through direct placement services or custodial services. Over 80% of organizations have reported major owner-related issues as the reported reason for needing to rehome that horse, compared to 50% of organizations reporting horse-related issues. So an owner-related issue would be something like the owner's financial status, maybe they're relocating, maybe they're aging out of the ability to care for their horse. Maybe they're sick. You know, with COVID, we're seeing that a lot of owners are becoming debilitated with illness, entering the hospital, and then someone needs to care for their horse. Horse-related issues would be something like the horse's age. Maybe the horse is no longer suited for the needs of the owner. Maybe the horse behaviorally is difficult. Maybe they have health issues that are becoming burdensome for the owner to treat. So for rehoming specifically, so owners requesting help rehoming, I don't want to say the burden, but the reasoning behind horses ending up in shelters through owner requested rehoming and owner surrender is really heavily skewing towards owner related issues. So that's good news, because that means we can work on owner related issues, you know, identifying areas of responsible ownership, what to do if something happens to you, what to do if your financial situation changes, are all things everybody can kind of take personal responsibility for and start communicating about. Next slide, Ash. Comparative is owner requested euthanasia. And this is something we see largely in the dog and cat world, where getting assistance euthanizing an animal in need, maybe that's a service that's not easily accessible to you. There's a time in every animal's life where this becomes a service that is required. It's very common services. It's a very common service provided by small animal sheltering, and it's becoming a more common service provided by large animal sheltering. So if you're in New England, for instance, euthanasia and aftercare can be very difficult to access, the aftercare of the body especially. So that can be a reason that can bar people from accessing that service if they need it. So what they do is they call a shelter asking for help. And in terms of owner requested euthanasia, the shelters also report the reasoning behind the request for the owner requested euthanasia. Less than 30% of shelters report owner-related issues as requests for euthanasia services, and 50% of organizations report equine-related reasons. So looking at this data in terms of rehoming versus euthanasia requests, something like euthanasia, owners are really only calling because the horse needs help. Their physical illness is preventing them from living a comfortable, humane life. Their age is preventing them from living a comfortable, humane life. In New England, I keep referencing New England because that's my experience. Winters can be very difficult on elderly horses. Pastures get icy. The temperatures get very low. So for many people, age becomes a factor in caring for a horse in the environment we're living in. These are all reasons that owners call to euthanize. So it's a very different picture. And this is why this service is really important, but it's not necessarily a reason why horses are being rehomed. So in comparative to owners requesting rehoming assistance, that provides kind of a much deeper picture about prevention and how these owners can be supported. Next slide, Ash. So breaking down the data a little deeper, you can see over 50% is horse related for rehoming and nearly 80% is owner related. So breaking this down further, you can see owner finances is really kind of the number one, the most commonly reported reason why owners need help rehoming their horse, followed by owner health, And then equine health and owner age are fairly tied, and owner relocating is kind of back there. And then equine behavior is really kind of the most minimal reported reason. So that's actually, in my mind, kind of a good sign, because that means if people need behavioral help, they're able to access that, or if people are realizing their horse is not a good match for them, they're able to rehome them on their own. But in terms of owner finances, owner health, owner age, these are things that can be kind of accounted for. I need to make a plan for my 2 horses if I lose my job, or if I end up in the hospital, or when I'm elderly. And we've seen a lot of people start to reach out. I saw a great post online recently of a woman posting, she's getting up in age. She's starting to recognize that the labor of caring for her horses at home is becoming difficult, but it's not yet too difficult. So she's becoming proactive. She's looking for help at home, and or she's looking for someone to lease out her barn on the property to care for her horses. And it's things like that, looking at this data, that kind of starts to open our eyes a little bit to how we can get creative for caring for our own animals. Next slide, Ash.
Okay, so this slide would seem pretty obvious to most of us. However, in our history of working at a horse rescue, one of the issues that we saw repeatedly, time and time again, coming into the rescue, were horses that were unhandleable and untrained, and that can be a recipe for disaster. So if you're a horse owner and you have a horse and it cannot do the items that are listed on this slide, the chances of your horse ending up in a bad situation if something happens to you can be incredibly high. If, however, your horse can do these very basic things, you've already got a leg up in helping your horse transition into a new home. If you want to help your horse, just make sure that he or she receives the training that is necessary to perform these very basic items.
That starts at any age too, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And we try to caution people that we always think about finances for veterinary care, but you really should, if your horse needs it, you should factor in the cost of training as part of your budget being a horse owner. Again, this would seem pretty obvious when talking about veterinary care. However, we want to get you thinking about in terms of if something happens to you today, or even if you're considering rehoming your horse, is your horse going to be able to transition easily into a new home from a medical standpoint? So are there any medical issues that you've left that are unresolved that would be sort of burdensome for a new owner? Or perhaps you're letting something linger, hoping that it's just going to go away or get better on its own. Do you have a clear medical plan in place for your horse that addresses its needs in a manner that allows it to be pain-free, and something that you can transition and give that information to a new owner and have them be able to follow through? And it wouldn't be a talk about responsible ownership if we didn't mention responsible breeding. Certainly, we want owners to think long and hard about the reasons why you want to breed your horse. Responsible breeders carefully consider health, soundness, conformation, the athletic ability of their horse, the disposition, and obviously the pedigree. But I think it goes without saying that not all horses should be bred. Cost is certainly a factor, from the stud fee, the medical care for the mare, specialized care for the foal in its first few weeks of life. And owners should also consider the cost of the initial investment and the raising of the foal, and that might far outweigh what others are willing to pay for that foal. I can tell you one of the top calls that we get for assistance right now through UHC is actually for owners who need funding to help castrate a horse that they've acquired because they're having behavioral issues, specifically aggression issues, with an uncastrated equine. So to sum that up, unless there's a high demand in the market for whatever it is you want to breed, it's probably best to have your horse gelded. And I just wanted to do a quick plug on the importance of microchipping. So many pet owners are familiar with, or now familiar with microchipping their dog and cat. And it's pretty standard for animals being adopted from shelters. But we're starting to see it become more popular with horses as well, as a means of permanent identification. Microchips are invaluable to identifying your horse during a natural disaster, paddock escapes, as well as acting as a link to your horse's medical history. Can be used as an ID for competitions, and it is a legal form of identification for sales documents and transfers. But one of the more important points that we like to impress upon for using microchips is that you can enroll your horse in full circle programs that list previous owners, can be linked to rescues or individuals who would be interested in providing a home or a safe landing for that horse should it become at risk. UHC is actually currently offering a free microchip giveaway for rescues as well as individual horse owners on our website. So we do encourage you to spread the word to your adopters and horse community in your area. This giveaway will be running until we are out of supply. Okay, so now onto the heart of our conversation today. So estate planning. I first want to put out a disclaimer that I am no expert on this topic. So if you do have questions above what we go over today, I would highly suggest contacting a knowledgeable attorney. Oftentimes, we often think about putting together a will for our personal property and our belongings and things like that. But it's not really that common for people to have in the back of their head that they can include their living pets in a will and trust, even though it's incredibly important to do so. When you pass on, your horse becomes the property of your family, who may or may not have any interest or the required knowledge to care for your horse or ensure it doesn't end up in a low-end auction or an unsuitable home or situation. So how do you protect your horse if they outlive you? One of the first things to consider when you're thinking about estate planning is to identify someone in your circle who you trust to carry out your wishes when it comes to your horse. So think about, will this person be able to care for the horse in the event of your death? Will they be able to successfully and safely rehome your horse? So do they have the necessary skills to do that? And the second thing to consider is how you want this person to take ownership of your horse. So do you want to name your horse in a will, or do you want to create a trust for the horse? And we will talk about both of those options. Okay, so if you decide to name your horse in a will, you will name the person you identified as your who and give ownership of the horse to that specific person. In the case of a will, it is also wise to leave a bequest to that person in the form of cash or property if that horse is stabled on the property to help cover the costs that will be associated with the care of the horse for the duration of its life. So you want to think ahead for that. However, it's important to keep in mind that if you choose to name your horse in a will, these assets may not be readily available, as upon your passing, they will go through probate court, and that can take upwards of 9 months or so to be settled. This means you should make an alternative arrangement to cover the cost of caring for your horse during that time frame. And it's important to note that the executor of the will does have a responsibility to take care of the estate assets, which would include making sure, if the horse is in your will, that they're part of the estate, that they are cared for. One of the better options, however, when it comes to live animals, is to actually create a trust or a written statement that allows you to leave your estate to certain individuals or organizations, and you can actually spell out how you want your horse to be cared for after your death. The advantage of setting up a trust is that the funds that care for your horse are typically available automatically, since trusts don't go through the probate period that a will does. So they get to essentially bypass that probate period. There's typically two types of trust: a testamentary trust, and it's called inter vivos, which is also known as a living trust. A testamentary trust is a type of trust document that is created when the horse owner passes away, and it's laid out in the owner's last will and testament. Because the establishment of a testamentary trust does not happen until the owner is dead, it's by its nature irrevocable. There's typically 4 parties involved in a testamentary trust: the grantor or the settlor, the trustee who is responsible for carrying out the terms of the will, the beneficiary who receives the benefit of the trust, and the probate court who oversees the trustees that are handling the trust. And then an inter vivos trust or living trust is can be created when the owner is still living. So it can be drafted as either a revocable living trust or an irrevocable trust. And that allows the individual for whom the document was established to access those assets such as cash or investments and real estate property while they're still alive. So living trusts that are revocable have more flexibility than those that are irrevocable, but both types of living trusts bypass that probate process once the owner passes away, which in the case of living animals is almost always going to be the better option. When creating the trust, the horse owner will want to name their who as the trustee who will carry out the desired wishes for your horse. So you'll spell that out for them. As well as you can name a backup trustee in case that your primary trustee is unable to fulfill the request or happens to pass away. You will want your trust to provide information on how the funds should be distributed for your horse's care, as well as where any of those remaining assets should go if your horse should pass away during that time and you have extra assets, excuse me. You can also dictate how the horse should be cared for. So, things like turnout, what feed you want it to get. So you can get down into the details with this. And you can certainly disclose any health issues it has and how you want that to be managed. Generally, the trust will terminate upon the death of the horse. So talking about the pros and cons of each of these types of trusts versus a will, trust can ensure that your horse has the necessary funds to make sure it's properly cared for and offers more structure and oversight. But trust assets must be separated from the trustee's personal assets, and they must be used as directed within the trust document. So if you were to say to just give money outright to the new owner upon your death, there's really nothing that guarantees that owner won't use that money for other purposes, whereas the trust will hold them to it. The trust also allows for succession of the horse guardian, meaning if your first designated person dies, instead of the horse ending up in their own will, and then whoever's the trustee for that will can carry out, with the horse, whatever they want. The horse will actually be passed on to the second person that you designate in the trust to take over its care. Again, it bears repeating that the trust bypasses the probate court so that the assets can be more readily available to whoever is taking over your horse. So if you have to pick between the two, certainly talk to your attorney, but the trust seems to be the better way to go when you have a living animal involved in your will and testament. Other things to consider with estate planning is you can set aside funds for retirement for your horse, but be cognizant of what can happen should your horse outlive those available funds. Depending on your horse's training and suitability, you may also be able to donate your horse to a nonprofit program such as a therapeutic riding center or a school program. There's various programs out there that are looking for what you consider a highly adoptable horse. And the good thing is that donation can be considered a tax deduction for the fair value of the horse. Another thing to consider is what you would like to have done with the registration papers and your medical records for the horse. Ideally, they should be kept in order and included in the will and trust. And you can also include valuable belongings such as tack or even farm equipment. The last thing to consider with estate planning is your property. So the land, or it can be the land that your horse lived on. You can consider what is called a conservation easement, which is a legally binding agreement that limits certain types of use or can prevent the development of the land. And you can essentially specify what you want your land to be used for. One thing to note, however, is that conservation easements can potentially decrease the property value and make your land more difficult to sell. If this is something you're considering, there is an organization called the Equine Land Conservation Resource that you can reach out to for more information on that. Okay, so we've talked about what to do if your horse were what to do if you were to pass on, but what about if your life changes and you find yourself needing to rehome your horse? Certainly selling is an option if your horse is highly marketable, but if you're struggling as an owner, another option is to reach out to your local rescue or sanctuary and ask for help in transitioning your horse into a new home. There's also direct placement services or possibly transferring ownership to the rescue for evaluation or adoption. And I just want to impress upon you that rescues are there to help. They're not there to judge. It is in their best interest to help your horse safely transition into a new home or to help you find resources to keep your horse safe at home through the use of safety net programs.
And in terms of outcomes, I think people get really worried that you're going to surrender your horse to a shelter and it's going to be immediately euthanized. 80 to 90% of all horses going into shelters are adopted out. So, or the outcomes, 80%, 80 to 90% of all outcomes are adoptions, which is incredibly high in welfare. So that means healthy horses are going to be adopted out. Really, the horses being euthanized in shelters are one with irreparable behavioral or medical issues that can't be supported in a humane way. So if you're worried about contacting, if you need help and you're worried about contacting an adoption organization, they're there to help you. They're not there to take your horse and euthanize it. They want to help you and they want to help your horse find a new living situation.
Exactly. Just to add to that, I think now, especially with dog and cat adoptions really taking off, equine adoptions really becoming just as cool, with a lot of really, really great perks to adopting a horse now. What we don't want to see people do is post your horse for free on Craigslist or give them away to just anybody or send them to a low-end auction. By doing that, you are potentially putting your horse at risk for heading to slaughter. The UHC has put together a list of important questions that you as an owner can ask of any organization that you're thinking of transferring your horse to, whether that's a retirement facility or a sanctuary or a rescue or even a therapeutic program. These are a list of questions that you can ask to ensure that your horse is going to a reputable organization. Though we won't have time to go over those today, they are available on our website for you to look at. You can print them out and they're all up there for free. So one of the hardest topics that we discuss about being a responsible owner, of course, brings us to end of life decisions and euthanasia. I think it's always important to discuss this topic openly because it's something that every one of us as horse owners will more than likely come across at least once in our lifetime, and some of us more than once. And euthanasia, it's a lot easier to process when you understand what happens and what's involved before you're faced with a situation that is just incredibly emotionally charged. Having a euthanasia plan in place with your veterinarian ahead of time, as well as your barn owner before you're faced with that decision is so important because oftentimes these situations arise in the form of an emergency and a decision's got to be made quickly. And if you have that plan in place, the process goes a little bit more smoothly. Em and I are always available to chat if you feel like you need somebody to talk to about euthanasia, but also your veterinarian is an excellent resource in helping you through that process. So don't be afraid to reach out to them and talk to them about that in advance, just so you can develop that comfort level with it.
And like Ashley said, it's really important to make this decision and have the contingencies of this decision planned out while it's a logistical conversation and not an emotional one. The time to be figuring out, my dog is helping, the time to be figuring out who's going to pick your horse up, what you're going to do with the body once the euthanasia is complete, is not in the middle of when you're standing there crying, having to come to terms with what's about to happen. It's months, it's years before that. Get familiar with your local contractors. If you need to have your horse buried, if you want to have it composted, if you want to have it cremated, if you're out west, become familiar with your disposal areas. Many of the dumps take livestock carcasses. So again, just explore your options before you're faced with the really, really hard part. I don't want to say it's easier. Ashley and I have both had to euthanize personally owned horses. The decision isn't easier if you have it all planned out, but if there's no surprises, it's going to go much smoother, and it's going to be a lot less kind of logistically difficult if you're not having to make those kinds of decisions at the moment.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have talked about things that you can do to help you keep your horse from coming at risk, and all about being a responsible owner. But we also want to go over some of the resources that are available to help you in your time of need. The UHC is currently home to what we call the Equine Resource Database, which is a database of nearly 1,200 rescues, sanctuaries, municipal, why is that word such a trouble today for us? Municipal facilities, direct placement programs, and assistance programs that are within the United States. The UHC database also includes assistant programs for things like hay and feed assistance, castration assistance, veterinary assistance, microchipping, organizations that offer microchipping, and programs that offer euthanasia and disposal assistance. There's also things like behavior and training, transportation, direct placement options, a list of organizations that offer law enforcement assistance, disaster assistance. So the list goes on and on. So say, for example, that you're an owner that has recently lost their job and you need temporary assistance from a feed or hay bank, or perhaps you need vet assistance. You can actually go to the website, search the database for available programs offered in your area based on what your need is. And we will populate the results with any available programs in your area that can potentially help you get back up on your feet and keep your horse safe at home with you, because that's the ultimate goal, right? Or perhaps you're a veterinarian, or your elderly client can no longer physically care for their animals and needs help finding them new homes. In that database is the list of rescues and sanctuaries that you can search for, as well as direct placement programs that will facilitate rehoming or help you find a rescue that accepts horses that are relinquished by their owners. So there's really no one type of person that can utilize this database, and no one type of person that needs help. It's never too early to understand what assistance services are local to your area and for you to become comfortable with them. The UHC Equine Resource Database is there for everybody. So in addition to the database, we also provide free educational materials about owning responsibility. So a lot of the topics we touched upon today are there. We have a 38-page booklet and several brochures covering topics from rehabilitating the neglected horse, breeding responsibly, the estate planning that we talked about today, microchipping, and even information about how to decide if horse ownership is right for you. So if people are prospective looking for a new horse, they can look at their options there. Okay, so what can you do to help? On a personal level, as a horse owner, obviously own responsibly, have contingency plans in place for your horse, include your horse in your estate planning, breed responsibly. One of the other things that you can do is to volunteer at your local rescue or rehoming facility, be comfortable and get to know the resources that are available in your area. And you can donate to UHC or your local rescue to help them raise funds to continue to help at-risk horses. As I mentioned before, all of our materials on responsible ownership are free to the public. They're all up on our website. So we encourage organizations and owners to share that information for anybody that might be in need of it. And then if you work in the industry, we encourage you to consider spreading the word about responsible horse ownership, or even having your organization become a member of the United Horse Coalition. So that is the end of our presentation today. Thank you everybody for joining us and listening in. If you have any questions on either the data that you saw in the presentation today, or general questions for the United Horse Coalition, our information is here. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. Emily, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just that we're always collecting data, and Ashley and I are always happy to talk more about what we've learned and preventing neglect and promoting positive welfare and responsible ownership. Don't be afraid to reach out to us. We're always happy to answer emails, take phone calls, and we just really encouraged everyone to keep the conversation going, because that's how everyone hears about it.